Back in 2017, I began a full restoration of my 96 Bayliner by tearing it apart all the way down to the hull. From there, I began the rebuilding process, which included learning to fiberglass, rebuilding an engine and outdrive, learning to fare and paint, and even upholstery. Now, I've bought a 28-foot cabin cruiser, and I'm starting all over. Welcome, my name's Jared. Now get ready, because it's going to be a ship show. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Jared, and in this episode, we are going to continue checking things off the list to try and get this thing ready to be in the water this summer. The priority is still things in the engine compartment, mostly because I want to get as much done in there as I can before the engine goes back in. Access is getting tighter as things are going back in, but it's still way easier than if there was a motor. So, the first thing I want to tackle today is wiring. Now, speaking of wiring, the problem is, if you guys have been following along with the channel, the house battery and start battery used to live in the same general area, and I'm actually relocating my house battery, and because of that, I need to relocate some of the wiring. Now, most of that was actually pretty easy because of the way that it was initially wired in the boat. I kind of just had to undo a whole bunch of cable ties, kind of pull cabling back, and reroute it into there. I can actually show you that. All of these wires coming in here, you can see those are wires that were basically existing that I was able to pull back and reroute into that location. So the ones that are in there are for the amplifier, for the stereo, the DC breaker panel, which lives right over here. And the other one is, what is the other one? Oh, well, the other one in there is actually a wire that I did run off camera, which is the 4-gauge wire to go from my DC to DC charger to the start battery. So I can charge my house battery from the start battery. So that's what's in there now. There's a couple other things I need to run, but that is mostly it. Now, where the problem is coming in is back by the start battery location in the engine compartment. There was wires coming down, and that wire was labeled main. Don't know what that means. So I started tracing some wiring, and what we ended up finding out is 2 of them come in here. This is the access panel behind the helm, and it's inside the head. And we basically just have 2 fuse blocks right here. Each of those wires was going to each of these fuse blocks. Now, that's fine, but what I ended up doing is looking at those wires, and again, thankfully they're labeled. So what I did is I went through and looked at what wires went to what, and some of them made sense to be on the start battery, like engine ignition, or engine electronics, obviously, the ignition switch, the blower, things you would want running with the engine trim tab. What I did is I actually took those wires and relocated all of them onto one fuse block, and all of the things that would go to the house battery on the other fuse block. What I was initially thinking I was going to do was clip those wires back in the engine compartment, splice and put butt connectors in, and the more I thought about it, the less I liked it because it was going to get messy and a little bit confusing. So what I decided to, and I think makes way more sense, is, and I've actually already done this just because it was going to be very difficult to show on camera. I basically just took both of those wires that were coming up here and I routed them both to the positive on this bus bar, or this fuse block. Now those wires are both powering the same fuse panel, which are all engine related things. Now the other one, what I'm going to do is run a separate wire from that location back to the aft cabin, to the new electrical panel stuff. So that's one thing I want to get done today, is routing that wire and figuring out the rest of the wiring back in the engine compartment. The last thing I need to do as far as a big wiring run goes is I'm going to try and reinstall 4-gauge wire to replace the existing 8-gauge that was run by the factory for the windlass. The windlass is 500 watts, so it's on the smaller end, but 8-gauge is way too small. The total run from the start battery to the windlass is about, it's got to be close to 50 feet. Actually, more than that, it's probably like 60 to 70 feet. It's a 28-foot boat, and you figure there's some wiggles in there. So I want to get that wiring run. I have it. That's going to be tricky because, so I'm up in the V-berth, and right behind this mirror is the anchor locker and the new windlass. So you can see it's a little baby guy. But, so that gets pulled through. So that wiring is going up between the hull liner on the inside and the deck on the outside. So, and there is coring material in here, so it must be channeled out So I actually checked with some other people on a Facebook group for Campions and asked a question about it. And one other guy responded and said he's actually replaced his windlass wiring with 2-gauge, and he was successfully able to pull it through. So I have hope that it's going to be doable, especially because I'm doing 4-gauge and he did too. So now the windlass, I'm not going to show too much about that because that's probably going to be its own video, because I also need to install a solenoid and the actual windlass switch and do all that wiring and stuff. But really the main point is I want to get the wiring in the engine compartment out of the way. So at least run that portion of it. Okay, that was a lot of talking. Let's get into it. All right, had a lot of wire come in the mail lately, so let's start with the 8-gauge. Let's get up on the boat, get that run. All right, we are in the bilge. I got my 8-gauge wire here, and I need to run this 8-gauge wire from, if you can see this, it's kind of dark, but basically in this hole is a storage compartment up on deck, and that is where I'm going to leave that's where the original battery switch was for the original setup. So I'm going to put a battery switch back in there, but it's only going to be for the start battery. So I have currently my wire for the DC to DC charger, and then I also have the 4-gauge wire for the windlass. So if we look down here, I have already gone ahead and added it. So this is a small like ST style fuse block. I'm going to run an 8-gauge wire down to the positive stud. This is going to be, again, for always on loads, which are basically what's here. So we have bilge pump, CO2, mercathode, this purple wire. This drove me absolutely insane. I should have done a better job of marking things when I had, well, I don't even know that it would have helped me, because Campion actually labels all of their wires, which is super nice. If you can see that, it says bilge. This is for the fuel sending unit. Okay, so Campion was awesome in that they labeled all their wires, but this purple with white stripe in here, I checked every square inch of this wire and could not find a label on it. And I'm 99% sure it came down here into the bilge with these other wires and at some point terminated to a fuse that was powered by the start battery. So another always on load. So I could not figure out for the life of me. So I started tracing it back through all this harness all the way up into the cockpit. And I spent literally hours trying to figure it out, looking in the behind the head and the access panel back there, all this kind of stuff. I finally figured out where it was going. So I think this doesn't make any sense at all. No, that's not true now that I'm thinking about it. So I think, okay, now that I'm saying this out loud, it makes a little bit more sense. I found one purple with white striped wire up there, and it was behind the panel that had the switches for the lights and stuff. And there was an option from the factory for a DVD player and TV combo in that spot. When I pulled that panel down, there was a purple with white stripe going to nothing. And then I was like, well, why in the world would a DVD player, why would they run a wire all the way to the back of the boat? But I just realized that it probably had a memory setting like a radio. Anyways, with that figured out, let's get this 8-gauge wire down to this breaker panel, or fuse block. All right, guys. So I started to dig into this stuff and started running wires and started to realize pretty quickly that I didn't really plan this very well. So I had to step back and kind of make a plan before I started cutting expensive wires and wasting money, essentially. Previously, in those last couple clips, I talked about running 8-gauge wire down to that fuse block for the always on circuits, which is what I started to do, and then realized there's really no good reason to run that wire to the start battery. So I had enough 8-gauge wire, I figured I would just run 8-gauge wire, positive and negative, all the way up to the house battery. So that's what I did. Now I didn't show that because most of the time I was spent cramped in tight quarters where you wouldn't be able to see. And the reason for that is I really want to minimize the number of things that are being tied to the start battery, especially things that are going to be a constant load. I don't want to show up to the boat for a long weekend and find out the start battery's dead. So I again had to step back and rethink. Really the first thing that I wanted to do is get that 8-gauge wire installed. So I went ahead, ran it up to the house battery, kind of neatly organized cable bundles and all that kind of stuff. So then it was finally time to cut all the wires to length. So when I ran these wires previously, I just kind of let them hang a little bit long just to make sure I knew I had enough. And at this point, I was ready to cut them to length so I could crimp on the proper lugs and apply heat shrink. So once the positive wires were all cut and prepped, it became time to deal with the ground wires. Now, before I cut and crimp all those negative wires, I decided to put in a ground bus on the transom right next to that fuse block. The purpose of this is basically, well, exactly what it sounds like. It's to be the kind of grounding point for all of the DC grounds in the back area of the boat for the motor, trim pump, all that kind of stuff. And what that's also going to allow me to do is run one bond wire or ground wire that connects that bus bar to the bonding bus bar, which I'm going to probably show in a future video. This is a Blue Sea 4-post bus bar. I believe it's rated for 250 amps, which is way more than it's going to need to be. And on top of that, I plan on having any of the heavier gauge wires, like the ground for the battery and the starter. I'm actually going to put those two lugs overlapping each other. So in theory, that current doesn't even need to go through the bus bar. It'll just go from one terminal to the next. So then once I got the bus bar installed, again, it was time to cut to length and crimp and heat shrink and label all the ground wires. So I went ahead and did that, and we got all those ground wires installed on the bus bar. All right, guys, so after that last clip, I was working on editing this video, and I realized that it was going to be difficult to sort of show all of these DC wiring runs in a way that really made sense. I mean, I could get up in the gunnels with the camera and kind of show video of that stuff and just bundles of wire, but it's not going to be completely obvious. So what I decided to do that I thought would be helpful for both getting the point across in this video and also myself being able to take a look at it from a sort of top-down view is I decided to hop on the computer here and throw together a sort of quick diagram of all the wiring runs that I just did specifically for the DC system. So again, this has nothing to do with the AC or even really any of the bonding. I'm going to touch on that in a later video. But let's kind of zoom in here and show you. So this is obviously not to scale and things are going to be a little wonky here, but just to get the point across, just for your reference here. So the very left side of the screen would be sort of the aft end of the boat, the stern area, transom-ish, whatever. And then over on the right, obviously it's kind of cut off here, but where it says windlass would obviously be all the way up in the bow. Again, not at all to scale, but just to kind of get your bearings as to what we're looking at. So let's kind of start here in the aft cabin storage locker area. So you can see here I've labeled aft cabin, and that little storage locker area where I showed those wires coming in the beginning of the video. That is this area here where that electrical box or electrical panel that we've made is going to go. So the main components in here that kind of tie into the DC power system is the Lynx distributor, the inverter, the Orion XS here, and then we have the house battery just on the other side of that bulkhead in the engine compartment. The wires that I had to get run coming from this area basically would have anything to do that's going to tie into the house battery. So let's kind of start here with the Orion XS. You can see here I have the 4-gauge negative and 4-gauge positive going into the Lynx distributor in this area, but I also had to then run wire all the way back to the engine compartment to tie into the start battery circuit so I could charge my house battery through the Orion XS from the start battery. So we ran 4-gauge wire, and again, not to scale, not exactly following the routing path, just kind of a generalization. Along with that, coming off of the Lynx distributor, we also ran a 4-gauge wire along with that, a black 4-gauge wire that will come back and tie into this ground bus. So that'll act as the ground or return path for that circuit. So with the Orion XS straightened out, the next thing we needed to do was to tie in, well, this isn't a new run. This is actually one of the existing wires that I was able to pull out of the bundle and reroute into this compartment, and that is this 8-gauge wire here that runs up to the current DC breaker panel inside the cabin. So we'll touch again on that a little bit later when we get the electrical panel installed and tie all that in, just to show you that's what those wires there are for. So that was not a new run, those were existing. Another set of wires that we had to run were these here. So this is actually, I don't have it labeled here, but this is actually 10-gauge positive and negative. That is coming from the Lynx distributor and running along the back of the aft cabin and up to the house fuse block. So this is the helm area, obviously above the aft cabin, kind of a different level here. But that access panel inside the head is where these live, kind of at the helm station. So again, I mentioned this earlier in the video. I decided to separate all the wires coming to this area into 2 different fuse blocks. The 2 fuse blocks were already there, they were existing, but they're several loads on there, and some of them made sense to be on the start battery, some made sense to be on the house battery. So I decided to separate those into those two different distinct loads. So this one on top here is labeled start fuse block. Obviously that goes back to the start battery. If you follow that back, it's 10 gauge wire coming to the battery switch. Now that is also an existing wire run, one that I mentioned earlier in the video. It was labeled main. So that wiring was already there. We basically just swapped both positives over to the start block. So everything's being fed from the start battery. So this isn't everything, but just for example, we have our ignition power, we have trim tabs, blowers, anything that's going to be powered on with the engine, essentially. And then everything else on this house fuse block is going to be like cabin lights, blanking on examples here, but basically anything else that was up here that was tying into that is now on the house battery. However, because there was no more power wire going to that, that required a run of those wires that we were just talking about along the back of the aft cabin over to the Lynx distributor. So now we have house battery power wires feeding that block. Okay, so that kind of takes care of what's been added up here with the exception of one more. So this 8 gauge wire run, that actually is tying into what we just kind of talked about previously, this always on fuse block. So that's that ST fuse block that I installed on the transom. So we have 8 gauge wire feeding that, which is probably overkill, but that was kind of for future expandability if I need it. But so that's going to power our carbon monoxide detector, bilge pumps, mercathode, radio, memory, that kind of stuff. So anything that is going to be an always on load that I don't want draining my start battery. The other benefit of it going through the house bank is that's all going to go through that Lynx shunt. So I'm going to be able to get a really good understanding of all my power usage on the boat by minimizing what's going to that start battery. Okay, so that is all the house loads. The other wires that we had to run are this 4 gauge here, which you can see this red wire coming off of the battery switch along here up to the windlass solenoid. So again, this is going to be talked about more in another future video about the windlass itself, but I did again want to get this wiring run at least up to this point, which is where I stopped. I got the 4 gauge installed up to this area kind of in the aft cabin where the solenoid's going to live, because again, I want to get that done before the rest of the stuff goes in the engine compartment. So we got the 4 gauge positive and then a 4 gauge negative kind of snaking along here. Once again, I sound like a broken record. This is not to scale or how I actually routed the wires. It's just to kind of make it clear on this diagram. So we have those 4 gauge wires running up to there. That was taken care of. Now, the only thing on here... Sorry for the interruption. Somebody at the door. Okay, where was I? The battery circuit. So let's talk about that a little bit. The battery. It's all battery circuit. The start battery circuit. So, again... what I have shown here on the battery switch is not exactly how it's going to go. For one, that's not ABYC compliant. There's too many wires coming off of one post. And two, technically all of this stuff has to be fused. So there will be fuses on all of these power takeoffs. And again, that's another reason why it was helpful for me to lay this out, because there was a couple of wires that I didn't even think about. I was like, oh crap, I need a fuse for that. So this helped me as well as helping get the point across on video. So okay, so start battery circuit. I mean, we already talked about the 4 gauge to the Orion XS. That's technically tied to the start battery, but we already talked about that. Now, I still am going to have to run wiring to the starter for both the engine and the generator. Obviously, I'm not going to put those in until those items are in. So that being said, I think that pretty much wraps up the wiring runs that we just completed. One thing I didn't really talk about here is this bonding bus, but I do have a bus bar that I plan on putting right next to the house battery area that I'm going to tie all of my bonding wires into. So I need to run one obviously to the engine. There needs to be one to the gas tank, to the filler neck for the gas, any of the through holes, C strainers, that kind of stuff. So I started to label things, and then there's also going to be one wire that is going to run up to the DC panel because there's actually a bonding bus bar up there, so I need to tie those together. So I'll probably do that in a future video as well, talk about the bonding circuits and how I plan on doing that. But I think, hopefully, this diagram helps get the point across of everything we just kind of did in this video. I know this was a talking heavy video and not a whole lot of showing video because it was a whole lot of wiring run. There was a lot of time that went into what happened on this video versus what you actually got to see, because again, most of that time was spent running wires, getting the bundles all tied up nice and clean with zip ties and cable tie mounts and all that kind of stuff, and making sure everything was routed properly. And yeah, it was a lot of work. So again, hopefully this makes sense and lets you see kind of what my game plan in my head is, at least. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. I think that's going to wrap it up for this video. That is about enough talking for me for 1 week. So I hope you guys found that information useful, planning on your DC wiring systems on your boats. I know, again, laying that out and going over it with you guys actually helped me out quite a bit. So yeah, it's time to jump into some other stuff and start getting stuff. I mean, we're like really close to getting the motor back in the boat and the generator and everything. So I'm getting super excited. Still got big piles of stuff in here though that has to go back on the boat. So again, that's gonna wrap it up for this one. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and always remember to leave a comment if you have any questions or concerns or looking for something, whatever. Try and answer as many as I can, but again, that's gonna wrap it up. So until the next one, thanks for watching. Bye.